So let's go back a couple of weeks, because there's a lot of people probably watching, woken up, seen this and thought, how the hell has this happened? So let's go through it right from the start, 2 weeks ago, let's say.
Well, I think to start it 2 weeks ago would be to misunderstand the nature of what's happened. I think we have to go back to 2014, which is when Russia first invaded Ukraine. This has already happened. So it annexed the Crimean Peninsula, which is in the south of Ukraine. And it also started what was a sort of low-level civil war in the eastern parts of Ukraine, in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, which is the eastern part of Ukraine. And at that moment in time, the reaction from the West was, well, how can I put it diplomatically, pathetic. There was some very weak sanctions. There were some words of condemnation. Russia was kicked out of the G8, which it didn't really care about. And that was it. And so I think what the people who run that country learned was, we can do this with impunity. And so a few weeks ago, what happened is Russia started massing troops on the border of Ukraine. And a couple of days ago, Vladimir Putin made a speech, which I think we really need to talk about in length to help people understand why no one's told them what's coming, even though it was immediately obvious. And we know exactly what's coming now as well, because it's obvious from what he said, right? It's just it hasn't been covered in Western media. I don't understand why. So he amassed these troops on the border a couple of weeks ago. People in the West started warning about it. A lot of people started saying, well, this is just saber rattling. It's a distraction. What we need to do is just say to Putin, look, Ukraine's not going to join NATO. If you remember, we had this big argument with Nigel Farage about this on our channel. But it was obvious to me from the beginning that was never going to be the way it was going to go, for reasons that I'm sure we'll get into.
Okay, so, but why does Putin have this fascination with Ukraine? Why does it go back to 2014? Why did he want to annex the Crimea? Because surely that's an antagonistic gesture. That means that the sanctions will then be imposed on Russia. That will weaken the Russian economy. And by doing that, doesn't he weaken his position as leader?
Well, no, he strengthens his position as leader, because he's not answerable to people here in the West. He's answerable to the Russian population, and to Russian people. Expanding the borders of Russia is seen as a great thing. If you remember, and this was the case here in the UK and in America only 40 or 50 years ago. If you think about Margaret Thatcher, she was saved by the Falklands War, right? This was a war about an island off the coast of Argentina,
which we won.
Which exactly. So this idea that the greatness of your country matters is something that's been lost in the West, but everywhere else, expanding your borders is seen as a great thing. Now, as to your question, why there's an invasion now and why Putin is expanding into Ukraine, he explained all of this in that speech. And this is, I think, the right time that we should just break down what he said. It was an extraordinary thing. I don't think anyone in the West has ever seen anything like it. This was a president of a country who spent an hour on national television talking about history. The first 40 minutes of his speech, he talks about the history of Russia and the history of Ukraine. And his argument essentially is that the existence of Ukraine is a historic mistake. It should never have existed. The existence of Ukraine is the result of a series of weak decisions made by various Soviet leaders, starting with Vladimir Lenin and then Nikita Khrushchev and others. And the mistake, as he sees it, is that the Russian people, the Russian nation, which was embodied in the Soviet Union, it was artificially split up. And a portion of the Russian nation was put together with what he called pieces of former Poland and Hungary, and put together into one country, which became Ukraine. So in his view, Ukraine is a mistake. It shouldn't exist. He claims in that speech, and also in the speech that he gave this morning, essentially justifying the invasion, that Russian speakers and ethnic Russians in Ukraine are being genocided. I'm not exaggerating. This is the word he used. He says there's a genocide happening.
Is there a genocide happening?
I mean, my family live in southern and eastern Ukraine, and they're Russian speakers. If there was a genocide happening, I think I'd probably find out about it. But it doesn't really matter what the truth is. What matters is what people believe, right? And if this is what he believes, then that's one issue. And if he's just saying this in order to justify an invasion, that's another issue. Both are bad, and we can get into that. But so the first thing to say is he explained that essentially the Russian nation was split up. A piece of Poland and Hungary and other countries was glued onto a piece of Russia and made into a country. And these are historic mistakes that he says are sort of understandable in difficult time that the country was in at the time, but we cannot be held by decisions made at that time by weak leaders who made these weak decisions. So the first thing that you should know, this is why the invasion was always going to happen, because he's essentially explained that the Ukraine shouldn't exist. He explained why it shouldn't exist. He explained the historical reasons. He also made some other points along these lines, which is essentially that the Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, took on all of the entire Soviet debt, and it paid it off, and left, as he sees it, to Ukraine and other countries of the former Soviet Union, this great Russian inheritance, the land that Russian people had conquered over centuries, the great technological achievements, the manufacturing, the shipbuilding, all of that. So one of the points he makes is, he says, look, in Ukraine, in one of the southern ports, they've just shut down a shipbuilding yard, which was the foundations of which were laid by Catherine the Great, the Russian Tsar or Tsarina, or whatever you call her in English. So what he's saying is, we, the Russians, we gave you this stuff. We gave you this great culture, this land, these technological advancements, and you've squandered them. He spends 10 minutes talking about how Russia is corrupt. Not Russia, sorry. That was a Freudian slip. He talks about how Ukraine is corrupt, how it's run by oligarchs, how...
Is that true?
Of course it's true. Of course it's true.
But the same is true of Russia.
Well, of course it is, right? All of that world is run by oligarchs and is corrupt. I mean, would you say that the Western world is not run by oligarchs and is not corrupt? It is, right? Every country, to some extent, is run by oligarchs. The question is, does that justify their neighbor invading that country and taking over? That's really the conversation we're having. So he talks a lot about how Ukrainian education is poor and people are not looked after and the pensions are not great and gas prices have gone up and how terrible things are for people in Ukraine. So that's the second part of his speech, which is, so the first part is explaining why Ukraine shouldn't exist. The second part is explaining why people in Ukraine are suffering, particularly Russian people and Russian speakers in Ukraine are suffering. And the third part of the speech, and this is the final part of the speech, and I don't understand why it hasn't been reported on. I mean, the first two parts are important because they tell you everything that's going to happen, right? If you don't believe Ukraine exists and you believe it is your historic mission to save the people in Ukraine who are of Russian ethnicity or Russian speakers from being abused by Ukrainian oligarchs, you always knew there was going to be an invasion. And you always knew it was never going to be limited to those two regions. Because when he talks about, well, you've glued on parts of Poland and parts of Hungary onto Ukraine, onto this Russian piece, that means that at least half of Ukraine, including the capital Kiev, is within the strike zone of what he wants to achieve. Right? There's no question about that. So the invasion will not stop in those two regions in the east unless it is stopped somehow by the West, which at this point is looking unlikely. But his intentions are not to stop with those two eastern regions. There's no question about that. Anyone who tells you otherwise either doesn't understand or wants it not to be true or whatever. But those are the facts, right? He is going to invade as much as he is allowed to, and he wants to invade at least up to Kiev and probably beyond. Just in terms of that part of it. The third part of it, and the rationale for his invasion, is that he says that the West is meddling in the affairs of Ukraine. The West is meddling in the affairs of other Eastern European countries. The West is expanding NATO, which he says they say is a defensive alliance, but actually this is a way of putting rockets and missiles, and he goes through all the different rockets and missiles that the West already has and is developing. They want to put them all around Russia so that they could strike at the heart of Russia at any moment. So he is literally saying that Ukraine is planning an offensive against these eastern regions, which, some people in Ukraine are joking and going, yeah, we waited until Putin had 200,000 troops on the border. And then we were like, hey, let's do an aggressive action here. And the other thing that he says is essentially the West is about to attack. I mean, he mince words about it. He literally says that. He says the West is getting ready. It's putting nuclear and other sort of missiles in position to strike against us. And we must defend ourselves. Now, how you defend yourself by moving your borders closer to NATO, I don't really understand, but that is the argument.